The click of the keyboard seemed unusually loud in the otherwise silent condo. I stared at the outline I'd just created, a roadmap for telling the story of how our lives had been turned upside down by something as seemingly insignificant as a parking space. 60 minutes. That's how long it would take to tell this tale. A tale of petty bureaucracy, blatant hypocrisy, and ultimately, a hard-won victory. But before the battles, before the petitions and the HOA meetings, there was a semblance of peace. My husband, Mark, and I had moved into the Meadowbrook condominiums 5 years ago, drawn by the quiet, tree-lined streets and the promise of a low-maintenance lifestyle. Mark, a retired history professor, had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis a few years prior. The disease had slowly chipped away at his mobility, making even short walks a challenge. Our condo, a ground-floor unit with a designated parking spot just steps from the front door, had been a godsend. It allowed Mark to maintain some semblance of independence, to run errands and attend appointments without exhausting himself before he even left the building. The parking spot wasn't just a convenience. It was a necessity. It was the difference between Mark being able to participate in life and being confined to our condo, that we had obtained the reserved parking permit through the proper channels, providing all the necessary documentation from Mark's doctor to the HOA. It had been a smooth, straightforward process, and for years, we hadn't given it a second thought. The familiar blue and white sign, emblazoned with the universal handicap symbol, was a silent guardian, ensuring that Mark always had a safe and accessible place to park. Meadowbrook itself was a relatively unassuming community, mostly retirees and young professionals, people generally kept to themselves. The HOA, a faceless entity in our minds, handled the landscaping, snow removal, and general upkeep of the property. We paid our dues on time, followed the rules, and rarely interacted with them. Mr. Harrison, the HOA president, was a name we occasionally saw on notices, but a face we wouldn't recognize in a crowd. He was, as far as we were concerned, just another cog in the machine. Our days were filled with simple pleasures. Mark would spend his mornings reading, researching, and occasionally working on his long-abandoned manuscript about the Roman Empire. I worked remotely as a graphic designer, enjoying the flexibility of setting my own hours. We'd take leisurely walks around the neighborhood when Mark was feeling up to it, stopping to chat with neighbors or admire the changing seasons. Evenings were spent cooking dinner together, watching old movies, and simply enjoying each other's company. Life wasn't perfect, of course. Mark's condition was a constant reminder of our vulnerability, but we had found a rhythm, a way to navigate the challenges and appreciate the small joys. That we had built a comfortable, peaceful life within the walls of our condo and the boundaries of our community. A life that was about to be shattered by a parking sign. A parking sign, and the utter lack of empathy behind its removal, would ignite a fire in me I never knew I possessed. It would transform me from a quiet, unassuming resident into a force to be reckoned with, a David ready to take on the Goliath of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. The peace was about to be broken, and the battle was about to begin. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, nestled amongst the usual spam and promotional offers. Subject: important notice regarding parking. My heart sank slightly as I opened it, a premonition of trouble flickering in my chest. It was from the Meadowbrook HOA, a generic message addressed to all residents. But as I scanned the text, my blood ran cold. Please be advised that the HOA has recently conducted a review of parking signage throughout the community, in an effort to maintain community uniformity and aesthetic appeal. Certain signs have been identified as non-compliant and will be removed. This includes, but is not limited to, privately installed or modified signage. Non-compliant? Aesthetic appeal? My eyes darted to the last line. Any affected residents are encouraged to contact the HOA management office for further clarification. I reread the email, each word a hammer blow to my sense of security. The reserved parking sign wasn't privately installed. It had been approved and installed by the HOA itself years ago, after we provided all the necessary documentation. It wasn't a matter of aesthetics. It was a matter of accessibility, a matter of Mark's well-being. Panic began to bubble up inside me. I rushed to the window, peering out at the parking lot. And there it was, or rather, wasn't. The familiar blue and white sign was gone, leaving behind only the bare metal pole, a stark reminder of its absence. The space was now just another empty slot, Indistinguishable from the others, I immediately called the HOA management office, my voice trembling slightly as I explained the situation to a disinterested-sounding receptionist. "Yes, ma'am," she drawled. "The signs were removed this morning that IT was part of a community-wide initiative. But this is a reserved spot for a disabled resident," I protested, my voice rising in pitch. "My husband has MS. He needs that parking space." "I understand, ma'am," she replied, her tone utterly devoid of empathy. "But the signs were deemed non-compliant that you'll need to submit a written request to the board for reconsideration." A written request? Reconsideration? This wasn't a matter of aesthetics. It was a matter of basic human decency. But I knew arguing with the receptionist was futile. I thanked her curtly and hung up, my mind racing that I spent the next few hours drafting a carefully worded email to the HOA board, explaining Mark's condition, the importance of the reserved parking space, and the documentation we had previously provided. That I attached copies of Mark's medical records and the original approval letter from the HOA. That I pleaded with them to reinstate the sign immediately. Days turned into a week, and still, no response. That I followed up with phone calls. Each one met with the same dismissive indifference. The receptionist informed me that the board was reviewing my request and would get back to me as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Mark was struggling. The extra distance from the nearest available parking spot to our condo was exhausting him. He had to cancel appointments, limit his outings, and rely on me for even the simplest tasks. The frustration and humiliation were etched on his face. He tried to remain positive, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. The community uniformity the HOA so prized was slowly chipping away at my husband's independence, his dignity, and our quality of life. And as the days passed without a resolution, my quiet anger began to simmer, slowly transforming into a burning resolve that I wouldn't let them get away with this. That I would fight for Mark, for his right to accessibility, for our right to live in peace and dignity. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready to fight. The days that followed were a blur of frustration and mounting anger. Each morning, I'd watch Mark struggle to walk from the furthest available parking spot, his steps slow and labored, his face contorted. In pain, the simple act of going to the grocery store became an ordeal, requiring meticulous planning and multiple rest stops. His once bright spirit seemed to dim a little more each day. The HOA's silence was deafening. My emails went unanswered, my phone calls unreturned. The receptionist, now familiar with my voice, would simply say, "The board is still reviewing your request," before promptly hanging up. That IT was as if we had become invisible, our concerns dismissed as trivial. Point one particularly difficult afternoon, Mark had a doctor's appointment. The weather was sweltering, and the humidity hung heavy in the air. That I dropped him off at the entrance of the building and went to park the car. After circling the lot several times, I finally found a spot, a good distance away. By the time I reached the entrance, Mark was slumped against the wall, his face pale and beads of sweat trickling down his forehead. I can't," he gasped, his voice weak. "I can't make it." I helped him into a chair, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and rage. This wasn't just about a parking space. It was about Mark's health, his well-being, his very life. The HOA's callous disregard was having a tangible, devastating impact. That evening, as I helped Mark into bed, I noticed a new tremor in his hand, a subtle but unmistakable sign of the disease's progression. Tears welled up in my eyes. That I felt helpless, powerless against the bureaucratic machine that was slowly crushing my husband's spirit. "I'm so sorry, Mark," I whispered, stroking his hair. "I'm going to fix this, I promise." He squeezed my hand weakly, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. "I know you will, Sarah," he murmured. "You always do." But this time, it felt different. This wasn't a simple problem to be solved with logic and reason. This was a battle against indifference, against bureaucratic inertia, against a system that seemed designed to protect itself at the expense of its residents. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of determination. That I couldn't rely on the HOA to do the right thing, that I had to take matters into my own hands. That I started researching HOA bylaws, legal precedents, and any information I could find about challenging their decisions. I spent hours poring over documents, my eyes burning with fatigue, my mind racing with possibilities. I discovered that while the HOA had broad authority to enforce community rules, They also had a legal obligation to accommodate residents with disabilities, and their justification for removing Mark's sign, community uniformity, seemed flimsy and discriminatory, especially given the clear medical necessity. The more I learned, the angrier I became. The HO wasn't just being insensitive. They were potentially violating the law, and I was determined to hold them accountable. The amicable approach had failed. It was time to fight fire with fire. It was time to get creative. My deep dive into the HOA rulebook felt like navigating a legal labyrinth, but with each clause I deciphered, a plan began to form. It was during one of these late-night research sessions, fueled by lukewarm coffee and righteous indignation, that I stumbled upon a curious anomaly. The HOA president, Mr. Harrison, had a designated parking spot, clearly marked with his name, located directly in front of the community clubhouse, a prime spot, far closer than anyone else's, including ours, had been. Nowhere in the bylaws could I find any provision for reserving parking spaces for board members or community leaders. It seemed Mr. Harrison had simply taken it upon himself to claim the best spot in the complex, a perk of his position. Apparently, the hypocrisy stung. He was so concerned with community uniformity that he removed a vital accommodation for a disabled resident, yet he felt entitled to flaunt his own privileged parking arrangement. A slow, deliberate fury began to simmer within me. This wasn't just about Mark's parking space anymore. It was about fairness, about accountability, about challenging the abuse of power. I decided to do some more digging. I started observing the parking lot, noting who parked where and when. I casually chatted with neighbors, subtly probing for information about Mr. Harrison and the HOA's practices. What I discovered was even more infuriating. Apparently, Mr. Harrison had a reputation for bending the rules to his advantage. He had been known to ignore complaints about noise violations, overlook landscaping infractions committed by his friends, and generally run the HOA as his own personal fiefdom. One afternoon, while walking past the clubhouse, I noticed Mr. Harrison's car, a shiny, black SUV, parked in his designated spot. As he emerged from the clubhouse, I saw him talking on his cell phone, his face flushed with anger. He seemed agitated, stressed. An idea sparked in my mind, a mischievous, almost audacious plan. The HOA bylaws stipulated that residents could petition the board to make changes to community rules and regulations, and while I initially thought this avenue was closed to me given their silence, the rules also stipulated they had to respond within a certain time frame. The time was almost up, and I could argue they hadn't responded at all. Given the lack of substance. If I could gather enough signatures from other residents, I could force the board to hold a vote on my petition. And what would my petition propose? To relocate Mr. Harrison's parking spot to a location 3 blocks away from the clubhouse, citing the need for community uniformity and the lack of any legitimate justification for his privileged parking arrangement. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was a risky move, a direct challenge to the HOA president's authority, but it was also the only way I could see to force them to take Mark's situation seriously. It was time to turn the tables, to use their own rules against them. The game was on. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I meticulously drafted the petition, carefully wording it to be both legally sound and emotionally compelling. I included details about Mark's condition, the impact of the parking sign removal on his health, and the blatant hypocrisy of Mr. Harrison's privileged parking arrangement. I cited specific sections of the HOA bylaws, highlighting the lack of any justification for his designated spot and the HOA's obligation to accommodate residents with disabilities. Then came the daunting task of gathering signatures. I knew that convincing other residents to sign my petition would be a challenge. Many were hesitant to get involved in HOA politics, fearing retaliation or simply not wanting to rock the boat. But I was determined to try. I started by approaching the neighbors I knew best, those who had witnessed Mark's struggles firsthand. To my surprise, many were already aware of the situation and were sympathetic to our plight. They had seen Mark's decline, heard the rumors about Mr. Harrison's questionable practices, and were eager to support a challenge to his authority. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who lived across the hall, was one of the first to sign. "That man has been getting away with too much for too long," she said, her eyes flashing with anger. "It's about time someone stood up to him." Mr. Johnson, a retired lawyer who lived on the floor above us, offered to review my petition and provide legal advice. "This has the potential to be a landmark case," he said, his voice filled with excitement. We can set a precedent for holding HOAs accountable for their actions. As word spread about my petition, more and more residents came forward, eager to add their names to the list. Some had their own grievances against the HOA, stories of unfair fines, ignored complaints, and arbitrary rule enforcement. Others were simply appalled by the HOA's treatment of Mark and wanted to show their support. One evening, while I was collecting signatures in the lobby, Mr. Harrison himself walked in. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me, his face turning a shade of red that rivaled the fire extinguisher on the wall. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice dripping with anger. I stood my ground, meeting his gaze with a newfound confidence. "I'm gathering signatures for a petition," I replied calmly. "A petition to relocate your parking spot." He sputtered, his face contorting with rage. "You can't do that," he shouted. "This is an outrage." "Actually, Mr. Harrison," I said, It's my right as a resident of this community, and judging by the number of signatures I've already collected, I'm not the only one who thinks your privileged parking arrangement is an outrage." He glared at me, his eyes burning with fury. "You'll regret this," he hissed, before storming off. His threat only fueled my determination that I knew I was on the right track. I had struck a nerve, and he was clearly worried. The more resistance I encountered, the more determined I became to fight back. The petition was more than just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of defiance, a testament to the power of community action, and a beacon of hope for Mark and for all the other residents who had been silenced by the HOA's arbitrary rules. The battle was far from over, but I knew, with unwavering certainty, that we were going to win. With the petition signed and ready, I formally submitted it to the HOA, along with a cover letter outlining our grievances and a detailed explanation of the proposed parking spot relocation. I included copies of Mark's medical records, the original approval for his reserved parking space, and photographs documenting Mr. Harrison's conveniently located spot. That I also attached a legal memorandum prepared by Mr. Johnson, outlining the HOA's potential violations of federal and state disability laws. The submission was met with the same stony silence as before. Weeks passed without a response. That I continued to check in with the HOA office, only to be met with the same dismissive response from the receptionist. "The board is still reviewing your request." But I knew they couldn't ignore it forever. The HOA bylaws stipulated that the board had a certain amount of time to respond to a petition. That if they failed to do so, the petition would automatically be placed on the agenda for the next HOA meeting. And that meeting was fast approaching. As the date of the meeting drew closer, a palpable tension settled over the community. Residents whispered about the petition, speculating about the outcome. Some were openly supportive, while others remained cautious, fearing repercussions from Mr. Harrison and the HOA. I spent the days leading up to the meeting preparing my presentation. I rehearsed my arguments, anticipated potential objections, and gathered additional evidence to support my case. I wanted to be as prepared as possible, to leave no room for doubt about the legitimacy of our claims. Mark, despite his physical limitations, was a constant source of support. He helped me research legal precedents, reviewed my presentation, and offered words of encouragement when I felt overwhelmed. That he believed in me, in our cause, and in the power of community action. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. I knew that this was a pivotal moment, a chance to finally hold the HOA accountable for their actions and restore Mark's right to accessible parking. As I walked into the meeting room, I was struck by the atmosphere. The room was packed, filled with residents eager to witness the showdown. Mr. Harrison and the other board members sat at the head of the table, their faces grim and unreadable. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but the tension in the room was palpable. When it was finally time to address my petition, a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes were on me. I stepped up to the podium, took a deep breath, and began to speak. I spoke with passion, with conviction, and with the unwavering belief that justice would prevail. I laid out the facts of our case, presented the evidence, and argued for the relocation of Mr. Harrison's parking spot and the reinstatement of Mark's reserved space. As I spoke, I could see the expressions on the faces of the board members change from indifference to concern, and then to outright apprehension. Mr. Harrison, in particular, looked increasingly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat and avoiding eye contact. When I finished my presentation, the room erupted in applause. Residents stood to their feet, cheering and applauding their support. It was a powerful moment, a clear indication that the community was on our side. The battle was far from over, but I knew in that moment that we had a fighting chance. The applause, while heartening, was only the beginning. Mr. Harrison, regaining his composure, slammed his gavel on the table, silencing the room. "Order, order," he barked, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "This meeting will now return to order." He then proceeded to dismiss my petition as frivolous and without merit, claiming that the HOA had the right to enforce community standards as they saw fit. He argued that Mr. Harrison's parking spot was a necessary convenience for the HOA president and that relocating it would unduly burden his ability to perform his duties. His words were met with groans and murmurs of dissent from the audience, but Mr. Harrison plowed ahead. Ignoring the growing unrest, he called for a vote on my petition. Confident that he had the support of the other board members. To my dismay, the initial vote went against us. All of the board members, except for one, voted to reject my petition. The sole dissenting vote came from a new board member, a young woman named Emily Carter, who had recently moved into the community. She had been quietly supportive of our cause from the beginning, and her vote gave me a glimmer of hope. Mr. Harrison, smirking triumphantly, declared the meeting adjourned. But as the board members began to gather their belongings, Emily Carter stood up and addressed the audience. "I'm not sure that's quite correct, Mr. President," she said, her voice clear and strong. "According to the HOA bylaws, a petition with sufficient signatures requires a majority vote of all residents, not just the board." Mr. Harrison's face turned ashen. He had clearly forgotten about this particular provision in the bylaws. Or perhaps he had simply hoped that no one would notice. "That's ridiculous," he sputtered. "We can't possibly hold a community-wide vote on every little issue." "Perhaps not," Emily replied calmly. "But this isn't just any little issue. This is about accessibility, about fairness, and about holding the HOA accountable for its actions." She then proposed that the board schedule a community-wide vote on my petition to be held within the next 2 weeks. After a heated debate, the other board members reluctantly agreed. They knew that they had no choice. The announcement of the community-wide vote sent shockwaves through Meadowbrook. Residents began to organize, campaigning for and against my petition. Flyers were posted, emails were sent, and heated discussions took place in the hallways and common areas. Mr. Harrison and his supporters launched a smear campaign against me, accusing me of being a troublemaker and a disgruntled resident. They spread rumors about my motives and tried to discredit my petition, but their efforts backfired. The more they attacked me, the more support I received from the community. Residents rallied to my defense, praising my courage and determination. They saw through Mr. Harrison's lies and recognized that I was simply fighting for what was right. In the days leading up to the vote, I worked tirelessly to spread my message. I went door to door, talking to residents, answering their questions, and addressing their concerns. I emphasized the importance of accessibility, the need for fairness, and the power of community action. Mark, despite his declining health, was my constant companion, offering words of encouragement and reminding me of the importance of our cause. He was my inspiration, my motivation, and my rock. As the day of the vote approached, I felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. I knew that the outcome was uncertain, but I also knew that we had given it our best shot. We had fought for what we believed in, and whatever the result, we could hold our heads high. The time for talking was over. Now, it was up to the community to decide. Election day dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the anxiety that churned within me. The voting was held in the community clubhouse, the very building where Mr. Harrison's coveted parking spot sat just outside. All day long, residents streamed in and out, casting their ballots. I tried to stay busy, distracting myself with household chores, but my mind kept drifting back to the clubhouse, imagining the scene unfolding inside. Mark, sensing my anxiety, insisted on accompanying me to the polling place. He wanted to be there, to show his support, and to witness the outcome firsthand. We arrived at the clubhouse just as the polls were closing. A small crowd had gathered outside, anxiously awaiting the results. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Mr. Harrison stood near the entrance, his face tight and drawn. Surrounded by a group of his loyal supporters, he avoided eye contact with me, his gaze fixed on the door. Finally, the ballot boxes were opened, and the votes were counted. The process seemed to take an eternity, each moment stretching out like a rubber band about to snap. The election officials, their faces grim and serious, meticulously tallied the results. When the count was complete, the head election official stepped forward and cleared his throat. The results of the vote on the petition to relocate Mr. Harrison's parking spot are as follows, he announced, his voice echoing through the silent crowd. Total votes cast, 247. Votes in favor of the petition, 152. Votes against the petition, 95. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The room erupted in cheers, applause, and shouts of joy. Tears streamed down my face as I embraced Mark, our bodies trembling with relief and elation. We had won. Mr. Harrison stood frozen in place, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His supporters looked stunned, their faces etched with disappointment. The power he had wielded for so long had been stripped away, replaced by the will of the community. Emily Carter, beaming with pride, approached me and shook my hand. "Congratulations, Sarah," she said. "You did it. You stood up for what was right, and you won." The election official then announced that, as a result of the vote, Mr. Harrison's parking spot would be relocated to a location 3 blocks away from the clubhouse. Effective immediately, he also announced that the HOA would be working with Mark to reinstate his reserved parking space as soon as possible. The crowd erupted in another round of cheers, their voices filled with triumph and vindication. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense of hope and renewal. As we left the clubhouse, Mark leaned heavily on my arm, his face flushed with emotion. "I can't believe it, Sarah," he said, his voice choked with tears. "We actually did it." "Yes, we did, Mark," I replied, squeezing his hand tightly. "We showed them that they can't get away with treating people unfairly. We showed them the power of community action." The victory was sweet, but I knew that it was only the beginning. The battle against the HOA's arbitrary rules and Mr. Harrison's abuse of power was far from over, but we had won a major victory, a victory that would pave the way for positive change in our community, and for that, I was eternally grateful. The immediate aftermath of the vote was a whirlwind of activity. The very next day, a crew arrived to remove Mr. Harrison's parking sign and install a new one 3 blocks away, much to the amusement and secret satisfaction of many residents. Mark's reserved parking sign was promptly reinstated, and he was finally able to park his car with ease and dignity. But the victory was about more than just parking spaces. It was about sending a message to the HOA that they couldn't operate with impunity, that they had to be accountable to the community they served. And it sparked a wave of change within Meadowbrook. Emboldened by our success, other residents began to speak out about their own grievances against the HOA. Mrs. Johnson, whose prize-winning rose bushes had been arbitrarily pruned by the landscaping crew, filed a formal complaint and demanded compensation. Mr. Peterson, who had been unfairly fined for a minor violation of the noise ordinance, organized a petition to reform the HOA's fining procedures. Even Emily Carter, the dissenting board member, began to push for greater transparency and accountability within the HOA. She proposed changes to the bylaws that would limit the board's power and give residents more say in community decisions. Mr. Harrison, stripped of his privileged parking spot and facing growing opposition from the community, was forced to resign as HOA president. A new election was held, and Emily Carter was elected to replace him. Under Emily's leadership, the HOA began to undergo a dramatic transformation. She implemented new policies to ensure fairness, transparency, and accountability. She created a resident advisory committee to provide input on community decisions, and she worked to foster a more collaborative and respectful relationship between the HOA and the residents. Meadowbrook was no longer a community ruled by fear and intimidation. It was a community where residents felt empowered to speak out, to challenge injustice, and to work together to create a better place to live. Mark's health continued to decline, but he was able to enjoy his remaining years in peace and comfort, knowing that he had played a role in making Meadowbrook a more just and equitable community. He became a symbol of hope and inspiration for other residents, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, one person can make a difference. As for me, I continued to be involved in community affairs, serving on the Resident Advisory Committee and advocating for the rights of disabled residents. I learned that standing up for what is right is not always easy, but it is always worth it. And I discovered the power of community action to bring about positive change. The story of the parking sign became a legend within Meadowbrook, a reminder of the day that the community rose up against injustice and reclaimed their power. It was a story of courage, determination, and the unwavering belief that anything is possible when people work together for a common cause. And it all started with a parking sign. Years later, I still think about that parking sign. It wasn't just about a parking space. It was about standing up to injustice, about the power of community, and about the enduring strength of the human spirit. Mark is gone now, but his memory lives on, not just in my heart, but in the changed landscape of Meadowbrook, the HOA. Under Emily's capable leadership, continued to evolve. They implemented a comprehensive accessibility plan, ensuring that all residents, regardless of their physical limitations, could fully enjoy the amenities of the community. They also established a mediation program to resolve disputes between residents and the HOA, avoiding costly and time-consuming legal battles. The culture of Meadowbrook shifted from one of apathy and compliance to one of engagement and empowerment. Residents felt comfortable voicing their opinions, challenging unfair practices, and working together to improve their community. I often wondered what became of Mr. Harrison. After his resignation, he quietly moved out of Meadowbrook, leaving behind a legacy of arrogance and abuse of power. I never saw him again. But I heard through the grapevine that he had joined another HOA in a neighboring community. I could only hope that he had learned his lesson and that he would treat the residents of his new community with more respect and fairness. One sunny afternoon, while walking through the community, I noticed a young woman struggling to push her wheelchair up a steep incline. Without hesitation, I rushed to her assistance, helping her navigate the obstacle. As we chatted, I learned that she had recently moved into Meadowbrook and was impressed by the community's commitment to accessibility. I heard about the story of the parking sign, she said, smiling. It's amazing what you did. You inspired so many people to stand up for what they believe in. Her words filled me with a sense of pride and gratitude. I realized that the legacy of the parking sign extended far beyond Meadowbrook. It was a story that resonated with people everywhere. A reminder that even the smallest act of courage can have a profound impact. As I continued my walk, I paused to admire the community garden, a vibrant oasis of flowers, vegetables, and herbs. The garden was a symbol of the community spirit, a testament to their ability to overcome adversity and create something beautiful and meaningful. I thought about Mark, about his unwavering optimism, his infectious laugh, and his deep love for his community. I knew that he would be proud of what we had accomplished. He would be proud of the changes we had made, the lives we had touched, and the legacy we had created. The parking sign may have been a small thing, but it had sparked a revolution in Meadowbrook. It had transformed a community from one of indifference and injustice to one of compassion and empowerment. And it had taught me the most valuable lesson of all, that one person, with courage, determination, and the support of their community, can change the world. I've often been asked if I regret anything about the whole ordeal. Did I regret challenging the HOA? Did I regret the stress and anxiety it caused? Did I regret making an enemy of Mr. Harrison? My answer is always the same: absolutely not. While the experience was undoubtedly challenging, it taught me invaluable lessons about myself, about my community, and about the importance of standing up for what is right. I learned that I am stronger than I ever thought possible. I discovered a resilience and a determination that I never knew I possessed. I realized that I am capable of facing adversity head-on and of fighting for what I believe in, even when the odds are stacked against me. I also learned about the power of community. I witnessed firsthand the incredible things that can happen when people come together to support a common cause. I saw neighbors helping neighbors, strangers offering assistance, and a community uniting to challenge injustice. And most importantly, I learned about the enduring strength of the human spirit. I saw Mark, despite his declining health, remain optimistic, determined, and full of love for his community. I saw other residents, despite their fears and anxieties, find the courage to speak out and challenge the status quo. The story of the parking sign is not just a story about a parking space. It's a story about the human capacity for compassion, for courage, and for change. It's a story that reminds us that even in the darkest of times, hope can prevail, and that one person can make a difference. So, if you ever find yourself facing a seemingly insurmountable challenge, remember the story of the parking sign. Remember that you are stronger than you think, that your community is there to support you, and that the human spirit is an unstoppable force. And never, ever, give up on fighting for what is right. Because as I learned in Meadowbrook, even the smallest act of courage can change the world. And that, my friends, is a lesson worth remembering. The end. This is a duplicate key point of the previous turn. Skipping to key point 1313. This is a duplicate key point of the 3 previous turns that in O new text to add. The story has concluded.